Welcome to the John Howard Yoder Dialogues. My name is Scott Appleby. I'm the director of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Welcome. We're glad you're here. John Howard Yoder was one of the most insightful and effective proponents of Christian nonviolence, a view that has been underrepresented in the academy and in public discussion in general. While serving on the theology faculty at Notre Dame, Yoder devoted much of his time and considerable intellectual energy to the Kroc Institute, where he was a founding fellow. In addition to initiating courses on war, law, and ethics and nonviolence, which were central components of our peace studies curriculum and still are, Professor Courtwright is here, who teaches a course today on nonviolence. He also began an ongoing dialogue with faculty in military science that continues to this day, and again, David Courtwright has picked up that legacy in our dialogues with ROTC officers and others. Yoder's thoughtful engagement with diverse faculty and students on issues of peace and nonviolence was a model worth emulating. Therefore, upon receiving a generous gift from Anne Marie Yoder, who's also with us today, widow of John Howard, the Kroc Institute established an endowment fund named the John Howard Yoder Dialogues on Nonviolence, Religion, and Peace. I don't think I always do this, but I'm going to ask Mrs. Yoder to stand and accept our thanks, if you would. The previous Yoder lecturers included Jim Wallace, editor-in-chief of Sojourners magazine, Walter Wink, the internationally known lecturer and author of When the Powers Fall series, Stanley Hauerwas, Gilbert T. Rowe, professor of theological ethics at the Divinity School at Duke University, Judith Brown, Bate professor of Commonwealth History in the University of Oxford, Miroslav Volf, Henry B. Wright, professor of systematic theology at Yale Divinity School, and last year Avishai Margalit, Schulman Professor of Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and one of the founding members of Peace Now. As those of you who are veterans of this event know, we begin with a lecture, which will begin in just a moment, that our guest today, Professor Sharp, will give, and then we will have some questions, a few questions after the lecture, and we would privilege those of you who will not be able to attend the dialogue. If you have questions and you can't be at the dialogue, you'll have a chance to ask your questions of Professor Sharp at that point. After that, around 12:15 or so, there's a buffet lunch in the Great Hall that you're all welcome to participate in, and then we'll move into C-103, the room right across the way, for a dialogue with Gene Sharp, following on his remarks and other topics related to peace and nonviolence. Gene Sharp, the Yoder lecturer this year, is senior scholar at the Albert Einstein Institute in Boston, which he founded in 1983 to promote research, policy studies, and education on the strategic uses of nonviolent struggle in the face of dictatorship, war, genocide, and oppression. He held research appointments in Harvard University's Center for International Affairs for nearly 30 years and is professor emeritus of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Professor Sharp earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from Ohio State University, we'll overlook that, and a doctorate in political theory from Oxford University. Sharp maintains that the major unsolved political problems of our time, dictatorship, genocide, war, social oppression, and popular powerlessness, can only be remedied if people rethink politics in order to develop fresh strategies and programs. He is convinced that pragmatic, strategically planned, nonviolent struggle can be made highly effective as a means of lifting oppression. You might call his approach winning through nonviolence. Here's a quote from Professor Sharp. When people refuse their cooperation, withhold their help, and persist in their disobedience and defiance, they are denying their opponent the basic human assistance and cooperation which any government or hierarchical system requires. If they do this in sufficient numbers for long enough, that government or hierarchical system will no longer have power. This is the basic political assumption of nonviolent action. That's from The Politics of Nonviolent Action, Part 1, Power and Struggle. Dr. Sharp is the author of several books on nonviolent struggle. I can't mention them all here. His writings have been published in English in several countries and in 27 other languages and counting. His Politics of Nonviolent Action, which I just mentioned, 1973, was immediately hailed as a classic and the definitive study of nonviolent struggle. In 2004, Thomas Weber wrote in the journal Peace and Change, quote, "There appear to be two approaches to nonviolence. They have been termed principled, where emphasis is on human harmony and a moral rejection of violence and coercion, and pragmatic, where conflict is seen as normal and the rejection of violence as an effective way of challenging power. Failure to distinguish between these two strands," he wrote, "can lead to a diminution in the effectiveness of nonviolent action and can cause confusion among the audience. The acknowledged leading figures representing these approaches are Mahatma Gandhi and Gene Sharp. Sharp was once an idealistic seeker after Gandhi, yet his later work is characterized by hard-bitten realism. He now champions a technique approach to nonviolent action, arguing that it should be used for pragmatic rather than religious or ethical reasons. Depending on how one looks at it, Sharp either has gone beyond Gandhi, making nonviolence a more practically available method of struggle, or has ditched the elements of Gandhi's philosophy in action in a way that diminishes nonviolence. Perhaps rather than debating the merits of each approach, they can be seen as indicating alternative paths to the traveler who does not want to use violence." That's a quote from Professor Weber, and I mention it. I don't know whether this is throwing down the gauntlet or helping further to clarify the profile, but I'll leave that to you. It's not often that we have someone on campus whose one of early books, the preface, the introduction, was written by Albert Einstein, but that's one of the many distinctions of Professor Sharp, and I'm delighted to welcome him, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him as he speaks today on Principled Nonviolence, Options for Action.
Thank you all. It's good to be here. Individuals who believe in principled, that is moral or religious nonviolence, often face the problem of how to practice such a belief. Should that belief be simply a personal creed affecting only individual behavior? Or should that principle permit believers, or even oblige them, to participate actively in society and politics in attempts to decrease violence, especially when the violence is extreme? How believers in principled nonviolence choose to act may vary, as there may be more than one course of action that is compatible with their beliefs, as well as actions involving or using violence. These alternative courses of action may take different forms and have different consequences. All possible courses of action may not be equally desirable. Therefore, it's important to consider some issues involved in that selection of the form of action and in evaluating possible consequences. Some believers in principled nonviolence assume that the sole important issue is whether their personal actions are harmonious with the principle, or instead violated. Do they use violence or not? It can be argued that there are times and conditions when exclusive concentration on one's own behavior and perhaps the development of one's spirituality, doing no harm to others, is an adequate application of principled nonviolence. Yet the argument may still continue. Human beings obviously do not live in a perfect world, or a world based on principled nonviolence, but instead they live in a world of much violence. When grave conflicts bring suffering, danger, or death to others, does not the believer in principled nonviolence have a responsibility to act effectively? How are believers in principled nonviolence to act in such a world. In such cases, it is clear the answer to the question of how best to practice a belief in principled nonviolence ought not to be determined solely by assessment of the relationship between the individual and the principle. What about the needs posed by human suffering, hostile violence, and oppression? Can the individual live in harmony with the principle while simultaneously attempting to meet the needs of the wider society? And if so, how? The individual, the principle, and the society constitute a three-way relationship, not solely between the principle and the individual believer. A second important question arises. Can a moral or religious principle of nonviolence be practically applied in the harsh political world? Or must the principle be violated or compromised in acute situations because actions in harmony with the principle are believed to be irrelevant or too weak to be effective? Do not the believers have a responsibility to attempt to oppose and remove social and political wrongs imposed by hostile violence? Is not submission to violence in the form of oppression and tyranny morally unacceptable? Does not a belief in principled nonviolence require one to confront and attempt to remove such oppression and tyranny? Not blindly, but with good judgment, skill, and effectiveness. As many have demonstrated, and some have learned, pleading, talking, and negotiating do not remove such expressions of hostile violence. How then are believers to act? The basic issue becomes, at least in part, how believers in principled nonviolence can move towards correcting those experiences, those expressions of violence without themselves participating in violence. Can the belief in principled nonviolence be applied in the face of hostile violence in sufficiently powerful ways as to be at least equally as effective as violence in the same conflict? Applying principled nonviolence in the wider society is often very difficult, particularly in acute conflicts. It has often been assumed that the world, in quotation marks, necessarily operates by different means than are appropriate for individuals, especially those individuals who believe in principled nonviolence. Those means, it is thought, must be evaluated by different standards than those appropriate for individuals. Consequently, it is thought by some, the best that the believer in principled nonviolence can do is to refuse to participate in the violence or perhaps protest against it. In an acute conflict with violent opponents, such as foreign invasions, occupations, dictatorships, and extreme oppression, it has been often assumed that it is necessary to apply strong violence if the perpetrators of hostile violence are not to be given free rein. Strictly nonviolent behavior, it seems to most people unrealistic in such situations. Failure to wage violence has been seen to be an abdication of responsibility to the whole society. This counter-violence clearly violates the avowed principle of nonviolence. Yet in the absence of effective alternative means of struggle, resort to resistance violence has appeared to be almost inevitable. Simple rejection by believers in principled nonviolence of the use of violence also has its problems. It can be argued that people who passively submit to the hostile violence of others are themselves violating their own principles, albeit in different ways than those who use violence. By submitting instead of opposing violence, they passively help the hostile violence to succeed. Believers in principled nonviolence who have tried to live in this world and to be responsible to their fellow.
The previous Yoder lecturers included Jim Wallace, editor-in-chief of Sojourners magazine, Walter Wink, the internationally known lecturer and author of When the Powers Fall series, Stanley Hauerwas, Gilbert T. Rowe. While serving on the theology faculty at Notre Dame, Yoder devoted much of his time and considerable intellectual energy to the Kroc Institute, where he was a founding fellow. In addition to initiating courses on war, law, and ethics and nonviolence, which were central components of our peace studies curriculum and still are, Professor Courtwright is here, who teaches a course today on nonviolence. He also began an ongoing dialogue with faculty in military science that continues to this day, and again, David Courtwright has picked up that legacy in our dialogues with ROTC officers and others. Yoder's thoughtful engagement with diverse faculty and students on issues of peace and nonviolence was a model worth emulating. Therefore, upon receiving a generous gift from Anne Marie Yoder, who's also with us today, widow of John Howard, the Kroc Institute established an endowment fund named the John Howard Yoder Dialogues on Nonviolence, Religion, and Peace. I don't think I always do this, but I'm going to ask Mrs. Yoder to stand and accept our thanks, if you would. Welcome to the John Howard Yoder Dialogues. My name is Scott Appleby. I'm the director of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Welcome. We're glad you're here. John Howard Yoder was one of the most insightful and effective proponents of Christian nonviolence, a view that has been underrepresented in the academy and in public discussion in general.